Hi everyone, I'm very excited to be part of this great seminar series and would like to thank Scott, Michael, and Jim for organizing. My presentation, titled Precursor or Interloper Violet Jacob in the Debatable Land Between Scotland, Empire, and Beyond, will examine the balance sheet of Jacob's contribution to the revival of a Scottish literary tradition as drawn up by Hugh MacDiarmid through the lenses of Jacob's own writing and peripatetic life. Jacob's vernacular poetry earned her praise as a precursor to the Scottish literary renaissance of the 1920s, and six of her poems in the vernacular were included in John Buchan's foundational anthology, The Northern Muse. However, Jacob attracted criticism from MacDiarmid, who deemed her contribution unsatisfactory on the grounds of her apparent obliviousness to the vital problems confronting Scottish nationality, which resulted in her contributing a mere new consciousness of technique to vernacular verse, and of her failure as a novelist to found or to further a Scottish, not an English tradition. Rather than dispute MacDiarmid's assessment, my intent is to set the arguments he advances to explain Jacob's belonging within the nation space of a reviving Scottish literary tradition in conversation with Jacob's own writing. I will focus on two thematic threads that run through Jacob's prose: that of interlopers who inhabit cracks within bounded communities, and that of debatable lands traversed by multiple potentialities kept open by irreconcilable contradictions, as vectors which carry an immanent critique of the criteria on which Jacob's contribution to the Scottish literary tradition was judged. First, I will explore the ways in which Jacob is depicted by MacDiarmid as inhabiting the nation space of the Scottish literary tradition as an interloper, whose life and writing are not animated by national and imperial patriotism enough, and whose right to belong is consequently put into question. I will trace out Jacob's recording of her imperial experiences in her diaries, as well as her literary engagement with the figure of the interloper, critique these very processes of imposter information. Secondly, I will trace the ways in which Jacob's representation of debatable lands depicts forms of antisyzygy which realize the radical open-endedness that the version proposed by MacDiarmid following Gregory Smith asserts but cannot achieve because of its nationed delimitations. This imagination, I will suggest, speaks to Jacob's belonging within the space of undecidability of the debatable land that divides and connects her belongings within Scotland, India, and beyond. I will conclude by reflecting on the ways in which the immanent critique that Jacob's prose brings to MacDiarmid's theorizing shows the totality of the sociocultural space of the Renaissance, and possibly Scottish literature more widely, to be fundamentally negativized by what contradicts its nation framework and by the impossibility for such a framework to resolve and dispel the contradictions which negate its wholeness. Jacob's poetry drew positive assessments from her contemporaries, based on its use of the vernacular and departure from Cailliard sentimentality. In his preface to Jacob's Songs of Angus, Buchan comments, Mr. Jacob has this rare distinction. She writes Scots because what she has to say could not be written otherwise, and retain its peculiar quality. It is good Scots, but above all, it's a living speech, with the accent of the natural voice, and not a skilful mosaic of robust words. By achieving such naturalness, Jacob contributes to what MacDiarmid sees as the fundamental mission to bring about a new psychological approach through the use in Scottish verse of Scots as a true and natural psychological language of North Britain. However, MacDiarmid is harshly critical of most of Jacob's work, which he sees as failing to contribute to the development of a Scottish literary tradition. For MacDiarmid, Jacob is markedly racial in character. She is yet seldom, if ever, nationalistic in tone. By some psychological slight, her Scottish patriotism is constrained to express itself solely in non controversial directions and to turn a blind eye to all else. This is a problem for McDermott, who holds race consciousness to be a key principle for drawing individuals together into a homogeneous social framework, safe from alien interference and free to develop in whatever direction feels right. Jacob's failure to translate any race consciousness into her writing puts her in a position from which she cannot work towards the survival of Scotland and its literary tradition. As McDermott asserts, she makes no appeal to the lapsed masses for whom Scotland has ceased to mean what it means to her, regardless of the fact that unless they can somehow be reclaimed, the Scotland which means so much to her may soon disappear altogether. In particular, McDermott sees as paramount the need for the Scottish literary tradition to develop as different from its English counterpart. And Jacob proceeds in the opposite direction by writing what McDermott calls English novels. He says, Jacob's English novels, The Ship Sailors and The History of Ethan Waring, are Mrs. at work, in the sense that the inverted commas I have used are necessary in calling them English novels. They are really Anglo-Scottish novels, and the subtle failure that infects them, despite all the fine qualities brought to their writing, is due to the fact of the writer's insufficient naturalization in the tradition of the English novel. The proper business of any Scottish imaginative writer is to found or to further a Scottish, not an English tradition. As for her poems written in English, they have no distinction for MacDiarmid. Ultimately, for MacDiarmid, Jacob is not committed to energizing the Scottish literary tradition because of her apparent obliviousness to the vital problems confronting Scottish nationality today, which a better oriented spirit with a raciality of character could not have refrained from addressing. McDermott's assessment thus positions Jacob as an interloper within the Scottish literary tradition, intruding within the space without satisfactorily contributing to its survival. Underpinning this positioning are, of course, the nation definitional politics that attach to being considered a Scotsman, laid out by MacDiarmid in the introduction to his contemporary Scottish studies. These are predicated on the desire to further the interest of Scotland themselves and their country, and counter the process of assimilation inherent in the terms of the Treaty of Union, which have made it practically impossible for the majority even of Scottish people living in Scotland to think Scottish. By positing this, says MacDiarmid, by positing this commitment as the basis for national belonging, MacDiarmid substitutes for the homogenizing effects of English hegemony, which he denounces as quashing potential contributions of the various elements, the fostering of which would have added so enormously to the vitality, variety, and breadth of a truly British tradition, a Scottish variant, which entails the setting up of its own historically and geographically specific universal. If, as Etienne Balibar tells us, universals serve less to unify human beings than to promote conflict between and within them, the universal expressed by MacDiarmid is entangled with a form of national thinking which excludes in proportion as it organizes belonging. Jacob's eccentric position with respect to this totality and national thinking can be explained by considering Jacob's peripatetic life, which brought her and her husband from India to Egypt to English Garrison's Town. Her diaries and correspondence testify to how she developed profound and simultaneous attachments to Scotland, India, and her mother and the mother's Welsh homeland, which prevented her from assuming a bounded and exclusive Scottish identity. Her attachment to India is, for example, encapsulated in a diary entry from 1922, where she records looking for the garden of Secundra Begum. Jacob writes, "It is rather ruinous and has huge trees, a mysterious straggling succession of gross and old buildings and tombs, partly Hindus and therefore sympathetic to me. This evening I have been in my own India for a bit." while her essay, The Church and the Countryside, for example, registers her fascination with the English graveyards. In particular, Jacob's Indian diaries record the development of an attachment to India that runs counter to any patriotic feeling of the sort identified by MacDiarmid as propelling the literary contributions made by Scots returning from the First World War with a quickened patriotic sense. First of all, Jacob shears away from national thinking, i.e., according to Marko Antonsic, the idea that the world is divided into distinct national units enclosed by natural borders with a unique native population attached to these spatial units. She instead inflects the Victorian tendency to divide the world into different imaginative spheres, each generating radically diverse accounts and competing ethical claims. The most important divide being that which separates the civilized and the non-civilized, as Harry Bell tells us, by seeking to immerse herself in spaces immune to civilization and to be shaped by their approximate otherness. In Sarah Cummings' words, Jacob's desire is to explore places where there is nothing obvious, nothing labeled to look at, but the suggestiveness of old rural India, she writes in her diary. In parallel, Jacob distances herself from the Indian life one reads of in books, she says, made up of clubs and what passes for society. Is entirely averse to going to the real, official, dreadfully social ills, and is keen to escape the heat in a fishing hut far from any white habitation, in order to encounter India outside the watertight little world of the cantonment, Jacob writes in her diaries. Jacob's thinking does not partake in the imperial dreams of racial union. Jacob is like her character General Thomas Marney in her in her short story Other People's Gods, who confesses that though his undeviating wish has ever been to serve his country, he prefers to serve her at a distance, as doing it in England would condemn him to worship other people's gods when he likes his own so much better. The dynamics of simultaneous belonging and exclusion that frame Jacob as an interloper within the Scottish literary tradition, seen as intruding within the space without satisfactorily aligning with its spirit or contributing to its survival, are proper to the constitution of the figure of the impostor more generally. As one approach within imposter theory suggests, impostering provides insight into the mechanisms which hold the social world together. It is Jacob's concern to shine light on the latter that underpins the proliferation of imposter characters in her work. In some cases, interlopers become such as an effect of relationships built upon false pretenses. For example, in her short story, The Figurehead, Tom Falconer, mate on the ship William and John, encounters Montrose through Malvina, a representative of Montrose's high street society, and falls in love with her because she resembles the figurehead of the ship, which embodies the essence of the seafaring life Tom loves, and the seafaring life that Malvina despises. In the short story Leone, Cyril Castleman becomes involved with a beautiful houri on the outskirts of Cairo, only to discover that her oriental dress disguises a European gentleman on the run from the law. However, most notable is the novel The Interloper, which, set in the east coast of Scotland, dramatizes the interweaving of relations of unbelonging and belonging that define the figure of the interloper. We first encounter Gilbert Speed, the protagonist, inside the mansion at Wanland, as a strange laird who was a stranger to his inheritance. Having grown up in Spain, cut off from all intercourse with his native country, Speed comes home having been acknowledged as a son by the man whom he had called father. He had inherited his property, he had been received in the country as the representative of the family whose name he bore. He soon comes to see Wanland as home. Viewing the different landmarks of his estate from on high, he reflects. He had come to love them all. He had thought to miss the glory of the south when he left Spain months ago, but now he cared no more for Spain. This misty angle of the east coast had laid its iron hand on him. Discovery of his real identity as the legitimate son of a neighbor laird, however, leads to his marginalization and stigmatization as an interloper within the community. As Lady Eliza says to her charge, Cecilia, Gilbert's love interest, he is no more Speed than you are. He is nothing of the sort. He is an impostor, a man of no name. He has no business in that house. He has no right to be here. His whole position is a shameful pretense and a lie. You would not care to be the wife of an interloper. That is what he is. His very existence is wrong. And Gilbert himself admits, whatever his legal position, he was an interloper, a pretender. He had identified himself with one land and loved every stick and stone in it, but he had been masquerading for all that. Imposter theory also explores the figure of the imposter as well as the dramas, disruptions, reactions, and questions as they engender to center stage as primary engines of indeterminacy, uncertainty, and disorder. This is how Jacob may be seen to function as an interloper in the nation space of the Scots revival, as she exits the closed circuit of national politics of belonging to imagine the Scottish anti-syzygy as capturing the unresolvable contradictions that produce interlopers and debatable lands within but also beyond national borders. Scotland's function in the world is for MacDiarmid tied to Gregory Smith's Caledonian anti-syzygy, the coming together of ideas entertained provisionally and experimentally, and that and that absolute variance with each other, as crucially embodied by the Scottish national spirit and expressed by the national genius. MacDiarmid writes, all fixed opinions, all ideas that are not entertained just provisionally and experimentally, are anti Scottish, opposed to our national genius, which is capable of countless manifestations, at absolute variance with each other, yet contained within the limited infinity of the adjective Scottish. Jacob's fiction is replete with spaces and moments where opposites meet to create space for the unfolding of a myriad possibilities. The debatable land Her short story, The Debatable Land, captures this by representing Jessie Mary as she moves from a childhood spent with her grandmother in the wilderness to working life and abuse as a servant to Mrs. Muirhead. The mile or two of debatable track between her grandmother's hovel and Mrs. Muirhead's house might as well be 10, Jacob writes, because of the distance they mark between wilderness and civilization, but also because they represent contested ground that belongs to neither, and open up endless possibilities for the future. The contest will not be resolved in favor of either side, as in the debatable land, Jessie Mary will encounter a gypsy with whom she will escape. In other short stories, for example, Annie Cargyle, The Wade Monument, and The Black Man Hunts, it is historicities connecting present and unresolved pasts that operate as debatable lands, where upwellings of the incalculable unfold, again in the spirit of the anti-syzygy. It is worth noting that in most of Jacob's stories, for example the Lumhat and Sivi, the protagonists are not able to choose freedom and either return to imprisonment within single-track loyalties and conditions or the debatable lands they encounter persist as spaces of unresolved conflict. And the latter is also the fate of Archie, the protagonist of Jacob's novel Flemington. Flemington concerns itself with the conflict between competing allegiances that plays out in the debatable land of the 1745 Jacobite uprising, and with the proliferation of interlopers it generates. It tells the story of Archie torn between allegiance to his weak grandmother, Madame Flemington, and friendship with Jacobite James Logie. When Archie informs his grandmother that he will not go manhunting after Logie, though his loyalty to the government is not in question, Madame bars him from her guys, their residence, and from activity on the weak side, declaring, I will have no half measures, as I have no half sentiments. Parallelly, James cannot forgive Archie for being a spy. And Archie's multiple attachments, a reflection of his personality, which sees him ride every quality in his character with a loose rein, transform him into an interloper, true to nobody. Instead, Skirlin Wati, a vagabond, legless piper, whose destiny in robbing his body of activity has transferred, Jacob writes, that quality to his brains, shuns single track loyalties and attachments, and enjoys carrying government secret letters uniquely because it brings him into contact with new varieties of men. As confirmed by Jacob's remark, that the whole distinctive spirit of the national poetry of Scotland lies in his vagabond voice, Watty materializes the spirit of the Scottish anti-syzygy through his music, by sending dancers now losing each other for the more serious business of each other's individual steps, now enlacing again, while the odd woman out circles round like a fragment thrown off by the spin of some traveling meteor. Jacob's imagination of interlopers, produced by the inflexibility of the criteria for inclusion proper to different locales and of debatable lands where fixed schema are suspended and incalculable reigns, both anticipates the centrality that the idea of a Caledonian anti-syzygy will assume within the Scottish literary renaissance and expands its application beyond national borders, an expansion which must be read in relation to Jacob's life spent in the debatable land between Scotland, India, and beyond. So, three final concluding thoughts. First, this imagination performs an immanent critique of MacDermid's theorization of the Scottish national spirit, capable capable of countless manifestations at absolute variance with each other, yet contained within the limited infinity of the adjective Scottish, MacDermid says, whose combination of opposites at variance with each other is contradicted by this nation limitation. Second, this imagination realizes the potentialities the Scottish anti-syzygy possesses to break free from national thinking and into a space of non-contradiction which cannot be preserved within the nation framework of Scottish literature. Third, this imagination demonstrates the impossibility of flattening negativity out of nation totalities, whether cultural, social, or political. It demonstrates the ways in which the contradiction between the nation framework of Scottish literature and the countless manifestations of Scottish writing studies creates its totality as a negative one. Following Adorno, Scottish literature as a nation field of inquiry and body of literary text exists not with contradictions or despite its contradictions, but by virtue of its contradictions. This negative totality is one that does not call for theoretical approaches that assert diversity as the essence of Scottish writing or demand to expand the inclusionary politics of Scottish literature. Rather, it highlights the unresolvable contradictions that exist between nation framework and literary and critical writing within it, calling for exploration of how we may want to politically engage the uncomfortableness these contradictions generate. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you on the 5th of November for the panel discussion.